I had barely finished hanging the Trump flag on the balcony when I heard an indignant shout from across the street. I raised my head and saw my neighbor Diane marching towards me holding a clipboard as if she were about to lead a revolution. Her face was red, her steps firm, and her eyes fixed on the flag fluttering in the wind. "That just can't stay here." Her voice shook with fury. I crossed my arms, expecting an argument. Ever since I moved to that neighborhood, I realized that the place had an invisible code of conduct. The houses were practically identical. The lawns were mowed to the millimeter, and the residents shared the same political ideology until I arrived. She pointed at the flag with such force that I thought she was going to shout it down. "This is disrespectful. You're disturbing the harmony of the neighborhood." Harmony? That's what she called her absolute control over every detail of the street. I didn't say anything straight away. I just stepped back and admired my own decoration, a large flag visible from the sidewalk with the name Trump shining in bold letters. "Perfect. It's on my property," I finally replied without bothering to argue. Her face contorted, and then came the speech about how the neighborhood had standards to uphold, how that symbol could hurt sensitivities, and how we had to live in community in a respectful way. In other words, respect everyone except me. When she saw that I wasn't going to take down the flag, she clutched the clipboard to her chest and let out a dramatic sigh. "If you don't remove this immediately, I'm taking it to the HOA." The warning was given. She turned and marched back into the house, probably already planning a formal attack on my decor. I just smiled. This was going to be fun. Just then, my buddy Frank pulled into the driveway, carrying the extra camera equipment I'd asked him to bring over. He stepped out of his truck and whistled at the flag. "Wow, Robert, you really went for it, huh?" I saw Diane storming away. She looked like she was about to explode. "You just missed the first act," I told him with a grin. "She's threatening to go to the HOA." Frank shook his head. Classic Diane. That woman would regulate the color of your underwear if the HOA would let her. He handed me the bag of equipment. "You sure about this? You know she's going to make your life hell." "Let her try," I said. Some principles are worth fighting for. 2 days after the first mess, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Official notice from the HOA. I smiled as I opened it, knowing exactly what it was inside. A formal document said that my flag violated community guidelines and needed to be removed immediately. At the bottom was a familiar signature. Diane was responsible for the complaint. I took a deep breath, trying not to laugh. I knew the HOA in that neighborhood was strict, but this was ridiculous. After all, I had read the rules before I moved in, and there was nothing prohibiting political banners. I took the paper and went to her house. I knocked on the door, and seconds later she opened it with a victorious smile as if she had already won. "I see you got the notice." I held up the paper and stared at her. "This is invalid. Nothing in the regulations forbids my flag." She blinked a few times, clearly not expecting me to know the rules any better than she did. Then she regained her posture and huffed. "The HOA is on my side. They can change the rules." Oh, so that's how it was. If the rules didn't forbid something she didn't like, she would simply change the rules. I shook my head, folding the paper. Good luck with that. I turned and headed home, leaving her snorting at the door. It didn't take long for things to escalate. The next day, another notice showed up on my doorstep, this time saying that the HOA would be calling a special meeting to discuss the impact of my flag on community harmony. Translation: she was so obsessed with it that she was going to make everyone waste their time just to try to screw me over. I looked at the flag waving in the wind and smiled. If she wanted war, then I was ready to play that game. The next morning, I saw several residents walking down the street with envelopes just like mine in their hands. The HOA's summons had been sent to the entire neighborhood. She wasn't just trying to force me to take down the flag. She wanted to publicly humiliate anyone who thought differently from her. I looked around. People were whispering among themselves, pointing discreetly in my direction. Some avoided eye contact. Others just watched from afar. She had spread her narrative before the meeting even started. I crossed my arms and stared at her house. The curtain on the second-floor window moved slightly. She was watching me again. I wasn't surprised. These types of people don't know how to relax until they feel they've won. I went back inside and threw the envelope on the table. I already knew that the meeting wouldn't be fair. She had the HOA in the palm of her hand. But that didn't mean I was going to give up. If she wanted to turn it into a rules war, then I was going to use the rules against her. Frank stopped by that evening, bringing pizza and beer. He sat at my kitchen table while I showed him the HOA notices. "Man, she works fast," he said through a mouthful of pepperoni. "You know, my cousin had similar trouble in his neighborhood. These HOA tyrants are all the same." "What did your cousin do?" I asked, taking a swig of beer. He fought back. "Use their own rules against them. These people hate when you know the bylaws better than they do." Frank leaned forward. You need anything for the meeting? Moral support? I can come if you want. I considered it. You know what? That might not be a bad idea. Having someone else in my corner couldn't hurt. The meeting was scheduled for Friday night at Diane's house, of course. Her land, her rules. When Frank and I arrived, the living room was already full. Residents sitting on folding chairs, some standing in the corners, all holding copies of the summons. In the center, a table covered in papers, and behind it, Diane looking like a cult leader. No sooner had we settled down than she knocked twice on the table. Let's get straight to the point, she sniffled, scattering some leaves in front of her. The HOA values community harmony, and recently a flag was placed on a property that destabilizes that harmony. There was a general murmur. One or two looked in my direction. She turned the pages of her dossier as if she were dealing with something much more serious than a piece of fabric fluttering in the wind. There are no specific rules against political banners, but in order to maintain the cohesion of the neighborhood, we are proposing a new guideline. I took the copy of the document that was distributed before the meeting. It wanted to ban any kind of flag other than the national or state flag. Convenient. I pretended to read it calmly while looking around. Some people seemed hesitant. They weren't there because they really cared about my flag, but because no one wanted to displease the neighborhood leader. She crossed her arms. If everyone agrees, this rule can come into force immediately. I dropped the sheet in my lap and leaned back in my chair. Good, I agree. She blinked, confused. So are you going to take down the flag? Nope, but since the rule applies to everyone, I imagine you'll take yours down too. The silence was immediate because, yes, she had a flag of her political movement right on the balcony of the house. Her eyes hardened. That's not the same thing. Of course it is, Frank chimed in from beside me. A flag is a flag. You can't pick and choose which ones count. And who are you? Diane demanded, clearly annoyed by this unexpected addition to her carefully orchestrated meeting. Frank Miller. I'm a friend of Robert's and a property rights advocate. He wasn't really a property rights advocate, but the way he said it with such confidence made a few people in the room straighten up and pay attention. This is a neighborhood meeting, Diane snapped, for residents only. Actually, I interjected, there's nothing in the HOA bylaws prohibiting guests at meetings. I checked. I winked at Frank, who was trying not to smile. Of course it is. A fair rule applies to everyone, right? The murmur started. She realized that instead of cornering me, she had put herself against a wall. I just smiled. The silence in the room became heavy. A few people looked at each other, realizing the glaring contradiction in what she was trying to do. She didn't answer straight away. She was processing the fact that her own game had turned against her. That's not comparable. That a political flag is a political flag. If the new rule applies to me, it applies to you too. She pressed her lips together. Someone at the back of the room snorted. He has a point. If we're banning political flags, then they should all go. She widened her eyes, looking at the guy as if he had betrayed the movement. The truth was that a lot of people there didn't want this rule. They didn't care about my flag, they were just there for pressure. But now that she had been caught in her own trap, no one wanted to be seen defending something that was openly unjust. She picked up some papers from the table as if looking for some loophole. My flag stands for universal values. It's not something that causes division. Someone let out a muffled laugh. It was too late. I didn't even have to say another word. Her embarrassment had already done the job for me. The meeting, which began as a tribunal against me, turned into a debate about whether that rule made sense or not. A couple in the front row said something about freedom of expression. An older gentleman mentioned that he always had sports team flags and didn't like the idea of the HOA mandating what he could and couldn't display in his own home. Her control over the meeting was crumbling, and I just stood there, arms folded, enjoying every second of it. The room, which had once seemed like an obedient audience, was now a chaos of divided opinions. Diane, who had previously controlled everything, had lost her rigid posture. Her voice, once confident, now wavered. We can't allow symbols that cause discomfort to be displayed freely. Odd. So who decides what causes discomfort? You? That's an excellent point, Frank added, gaining confidence as the room's mood shifted. My comfort might be different from yours. I'm uncomfortable with restrictions on personal expression. Who's going to protect my comfort? Several people nodded in agreement. She tried to answer, but an older man sitting near the door cut me off. I've always hung my soccer team's flag on the balcony. Is that going to be banned too? A woman at the other end shook her head. I've had an LGBTQ pride flag in my yard for years. If this rule comes into force, do I have to take it down too? She widened her eyes, realizing she had dug too deep a hole. This isn't about personal flags, but my flag is personal. It's my opinion in my house. More murmurs. She could no longer control the narrative. One of the HOA members who had been silent until then finally spoke up. This rule could set a complicated precedent. We could end up censoring all kinds of expression. She turned to him, indignant. You can't be on his side. I'm on the side of the rules, not personal squabbles. Silence. She realized she had lost the HOA, which she had used as a tool of control, was now a weight against her. I leaned back in my chair and let a smile escape. She couldn't disguise the look of defeat. Her game was over. The room, which had once seemed like an obedient audience, was now a chaos of discordant voices. She tried to maintain control, but the debate had slipped out of her hands. This rule is necessary to keep the community in harmony. The only thing this rule would do is prohibit anyone from expressing their opinion. More murmurs of support arose. She realized she was cornered. The HOA member who had been silent until then decided to speak up. We need to take a closer look at this proposal before making any rash decisions. She turned to him, visibly irritated. It can't wait. Apparently it can. She pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, and forced a smile. Very well, the meeting is adjourned. We'll reschedule for another day. Translation: she lost but didn't want to admit it. People began to disperse, some still whispering among themselves. I just shrugged and left without hurrying. She wanted to reschedule? Good. I'd keep my flag waving until then. But instead of trying to beat me to the HOA, she chose a more extreme route. Frank and I walked back to my house in the cool evening air, both of us grinning like we'd just pulled off a heist. Did you see her face? Frank laughed. When everyone started turning against her? Priceless. Couldn't have done it without your backup, I admitted. Having another voice in there made a difference. This isn't over, though, Frank warned, suddenly serious. People like her don't give up easily. They just find another angle of attack. Let her try, I said, looking back at my flag still fluttering proudly in the breeze. I'm ready. 2 weeks after the disastrous HOA meeting, a bailiff knocked on my door. I was sued. She really had done it. I took the envelope, opened it, and started reading. The lawsuit was a complete circus. Diane claimed that my banner created a hostile environment, that she felt threatened and unsafe, and that my display of extremism was affecting the peace of the neighborhood. It was so absurd that I had to read it twice to believe it. I sat on the sofa and laughed. She couldn't beat me in the HOA, and now she wanted to take matters to court? I called a lawyer, not because I thought she had a chance, but because I wanted to see how far she would go. On the day of the hearing, when I walked into the courtroom, she was already there, arms crossed, with the smile of someone who was sure of victory. She had brought witnesses. Yes, witnesses. 3 neighbors were there with her, clearly hand-picked. They all looked uncomfortable, as if they had been forced to be there. The judge entered, and it only took a quick glance for me to realize that the game was already won. She was a lady in her 60s with a firm posture, her hair up in a bun, and a U.S. flag pinned to her lapel. When I saw that, I knew she wasn't going to fall for it. Diane started the show. She gave an emotional speech about how the flag was a symbol of oppression, how she felt attacked, how the neighborhood was suffering because of me. The presence of this flag makes me and other people feel threatened. It's a symbol of hatred. The judge listened without showing any emotion. When it was my turn, I simply handed over the official HOA rules, showing that there was no prohibition against my flag. The judge flipped through the papers, raised an eyebrow, and turned to her. Did you read the rules before opening this case? Her face turned red. This isn't about rules. It's about morality. The judge sighed, closing the documents and adjusting her glasses. The court doesn't deal with morality, ma'am. It deals with the law. She banged her gavel. Case 1. I knew this would happen, but the best was yet to come. The judge not only dismissed the case, but ordered her to pay for my legal fees. The shock on her face was priceless. She had tried to screw me, and now she was going to pay for it. I left the courtroom without looking back, but I knew this story wasn't over yet. She wasn't the kind of person who accepted losing, and I was right. Frank was waiting outside the courtroom, and when I emerged with my victory, he gave me a high five that echoed down the hallway. I knew it. I knew that judge wouldn't buy her nonsense, he exclaimed, attracting glares from several serious-looking attorneys passing by. Keep it down, I warned, though I couldn't stop grinning. She's not done yet. What more can she do? Frank asked as we headed toward the parking lot. She's lost, in the HOA, and in court. Twice. People like Diane aren't rational, I explained. When they can't win by following the rules, they start breaking them. Frank's expression darkened. You think she might try something stupid? I nodded grimly. I'd bet on it. After the humiliation in court, I thought she'd keep quiet, but she didn't. On the contrary, she doubled her bet. A few days later, when I left for work, I found my trash can overturned with torn bags and dirt strewn all over the sidewalk. Coincidence? Not at all. Later, When I got home, I saw graffiti on my mailbox, words like fascist, hate, and shame scrawled in red paint. I took a deep breath. If that's how she wanted to play it, then I had something better. I called Frank that evening. Remember those security cameras you brought over when this all started? Time to put them to use. He came over the next day, and we spent the afternoon installing cameras at strategic points around my property. Frank, who worked in IT, set up the system to send alerts directly to my phone. I installed security cameras on the balcony and in the garden, very visible so that she knew she was being watched. That same evening, while I was watching TV, I received a notification on my cell phone, movement detected. I opened the camera app, and there she was at 11 o'clock at night, crossing my sidewalk, looking at my flag. I stopped breathing for a moment. What was she doing? She approached slowly, looking sideways, as if to make sure no one was watching. Then she raised a pair of scissors. She was going to cut my flag. I got up from the sofa immediately and ran to the door, but before I could leave, she looked straight at the camera. She was paralyzed for a few seconds. The realization hit her. She dropped the scissors, turned, and ran back to the house. I stood on the balcony, looking out into the yard. She knew she was screwed. The next day, I took the recording straight to the police station. Now it was my turn to act, and this time she had no escape. Wouldn't miss it for the world, came his immediate response. The next morning, Frank and I arrived at the police station with the video of the break-in saved on my cell phone and on a USB stick. I explained everything to the policeman at the counter. He watched the video without saying anything, just nodding. She tried to destroy your property? I confirmed with a nod. The policeman let out a sigh, took out a form, and started filling it in. Do you want to press charges? Absolutely. This time she wasn't going to get away with it. Hours later, a police car pulled up in front of her house. 2 firm knocks on the door. She opened it with an air of superiority, but her smile disappeared when she saw the policeman. This is... One of the officers handed her a summons. We have a video of you trying to vandalize your neighbor's property. Her eyes went wide. Video? She looked over, and there were the security cameras shining in the morning sun. The officers gave her 2 options. She could go to the police station and resolve the situation peacefully, or be handcuffed right there. The whole neighborhood watched. Some people were discreetly recording with their cell phones. This time she had no control over the narrative. Huffing and puffing, she agreed to go without resistance. A few days later, she received an order and restriction. She could no longer approach my house, my yard, or even look in my direction without risk of further legal problems. But the best part, with so many people talking about the scandal, the HOA no longer wanted to be associated with her. She was forced out of office, and shortly afterwards, put her house up for sale. When the moving truck showed up, Frank joined me on the porch, both of us holding cups of coffee and smiling. She saw us. The Trump flag kept waving on my balcony, and the neighborhood, it was never the same again. I can't believe she's actually leaving, Frank mused, taking a sip of his coffee. Pride comes before a fall, I replied, watching as the movers carried out Diane's prized antique grandfather clock. Frank chuckled. All this over a flag. Was it worth it? I looked at my flag, still proudly displayed, and now completely undisputed. Freedom always is. Have you ever had or know a neighbor like Diane? That person who thinks they own the neighborhood, wants to control everything, and won't accept losing it all? If so, comment below. I want to know the most absurd stories you've experienced with neighbors who are the bosses of the HOA. And it doesn't stop here. Click on the card above and keep watching the videos on the channel. There are lots of real, hilarious, and revolting stories waiting for you. Let's go!